have accountability at board exec level of information and cybersecurity. And where things fall within the sphere of that stakeholder, then that stakeholder should be engaged. For example, if a business is making a decision with a financial impact, depending on that impact, they're not necessarily going to go to the CFO, but they are going to involve finance because they have to. Why should information and cybersecurity be any different? You can delegate authority. Those delegation, those levels of responsibility and the demarcation between those authority levels should be defined and communicated. So it doesn't necessarily have to go to the board exec level person, but where there are decisions that have a financial implication, an appropriately approved and authorized person is involved and has to be involved in order for that decision to be signed off. And this is where the OSbD framework would make it easier, because you would integrate everything that you have around requirements for InfoSec.
Hey Owen, thanks so much for jumping on today's episode. Hey, just to get things kicked off, mate, tell us a bit about yourself. Tell us a little bit about how you got Loopli started.
Okay, yep, will do. So, unsurprisingly for somebody in InfoSec, I started in IT more years ago than I'd care to remember or admit. Very much as what I call the lackey's lackey, unboxing computers for the person who set them up on desks and then wheeling away cardboard. But after that, I then worked my way up, did every discipline in IT, got up to lead design authority, so overseeing the architects and all the designs and implementation. Got into more formal management, where I was head of IT before going contracting consulting, focusing still more on the technology side, but having done IT security and information security management, and scope creep being what it is, I got pulled into InfoSec related projects with clients, and then slowly started doing more IT security InfoSec work, looking at ISO, GDPR, PCI DSS, Cyber Essentials, IG Toolkit, etc. And then obviously the deadline for GDPR loomed, which then created a significant demand for things around data security, governance, compliance. So that then ramped up my InfoSec related work, and I pivoted and focused predominantly on InfoSec from that point on, where I then went on to work with larger businesses around information security, strategy, and delivery. Off the back of that, I then identified various inefficiencies and complexities around how security was sort of managed and executed, especially around governance, risk, and compliance. And as a result of that, over time, I started doing things that became what I call my methodology of organizational security by design, which is taking the principle of secure by design from the likes of ISO 27001 that focuses more on infrastructure, application, solutions, systems. So it's very much technology focused, and integrated it with the practice of organizational design. So looking at more how you design, build, grow, and run businesses in a holistically secure way, which resulted in obviously streamlining and simplifying information security strategy management and so implementation and delivery, which resulted in significant reductions in costs and overheads, especially around InfoSec GRC. I typically see 50% reductions in spend and effort around InfoSec GRC post-implementation. And because it integrates and ties everything together, it also allows you to fully quantify risk, cost, and ROI of controls against risk mitigation, both expected and actual, therefore maximizing ROI in delivering the highest possible maturity capability based on the available budget and resources of the business. You maximizing your allocation of what resources and money you have for InfoSec to get the strongest capability that is feasible for you and appropriate for you as a business.
That's really interesting to say. I think there's two things that really stand out to me there. First and foremost, that sounds brilliant. You know, security by design at its effectively at its purest. I'd be really intrigued to dig into what you just said there about 50% cost reduction. So, you know, like how we quantify that, things like that. But I think the thing that's jumping out in my mind at the moment is that's all well and good, you know, for let's say you're starting up a company, right? That's all well and good because you've got your budget, you can start the foundations and you build upon those foundations, right? I said there, it's cybersecurity in that example it's like a growth engine for the company, right? It's we build it with the right principles, we set the right foundations, and for that we reduce waste. So we can take that money and either invest it into cybersec, or we can invest it elsewhere in the business, right? That's ultimately the main goal. But yeah, just on how does that work though in an established company? And I do want you to pick up on that 50% cost reduction part, because it's always about quantifying the ROI, which is the tricky bit. Yeah.
So I'll start with the how you retroactively fit that into a pre-existing organization. Well, the methodology was developed on established businesses.
Okay.
So it was actually adapted for new businesses. So it started off as something I was doing for businesses that had been around for decades, if not longer. And how that works is with your typical, I guess, project delivery, where you look at your as is, your to be. So you look at where are they, where do they need to get to in order to have a integrated framework and management system and achieve the organizational security by design. So it's not something that's painless, it's not something that's quick, and it doesn't necessarily look cheap, but it is cheaper than doing other things. And the ROI on business efficiency, so it's not just around the GRC savings, which is the 50%. Other savings are lower in terms of other operational efficiencies and effectiveness improvements. But in terms of getting into pre-existing businesses, you're looking at a combination of cultural change and, as I prefer to use the term, business in process improvement rather than change. So you're not changing things, you're improving things. And because the methodology is inherently modular and works on an integrated and is designed to be integrated essentially within the organization, what you're doing is flipping the approach that a lot of InfoSec has historically taken, where I use the analogy of Buckaroo the game, where you have the donkey. Obviously, I'm not calling businesses donkeys, but if you think about the donkey as the business, obviously a very intelligent and successful donkey, but think Shrek, I guess. And then what you're doing is you're taking all these items and you're piling it on top of the donkey, which is the InfoSec controls. And at a certain point, the business goes, you're loading too much on me, this is too much burden. And then the donkey just goes and throws everything off. So rather than layering things on and then having additional distinct and separate processes for InfoSec that you then call in, you build your modular controls, your modular processes, procedures, and policies, which then allows you to integrate it into the business and how it functions and operates. Because ultimately, all the business is a series of essentially workflows. And what you're doing is, instead of creating new InfoSec workflows and layering them on top of existing workflows, you're building a set of essentially self-contained modules that then you can then slot into existing workflows and processes.
So that's quite interesting, because that pulls out. I'm thinking of the political challenge on that one. So put myself in the shoes of one of your customers. You've come to me, hey, I've got this modular approach, let's build it up, and I'm sold on this. I've got to think about, okay, I've got to go to finance, I've got to go to what? I've got to go to sales, I've got to go to all these different functions that have all their own processes and go, sorry, I am the king of the castle. I rule basically a good portion of workflows here, because the underlying, you can do whatever you want, you can add whatever you want on top, but the foundation has to be information security. So I guess my question is then, like, how would you start that journey, right? Because it's very clear this is not something you're going to get, you're going to get done in a month or 6 months, right? This is a clear, like proper strategy.
It depends on the size and complexity. Yeah, it depends on the size and complexity of the business. It can be done relatively quickly, but it does depend on buy-in, support, and appetite. Yes, but the way the methodology works, it's still faster, cheaper, and simpler than doing other things in other ways. So it's not fast, cheap, and simple. It's just faster, cheaper, and simpler.
Go on, give us an example.
Well, I'll answer the first question first, around how you work with the various organizations. And how you do that is you look at it as, I'm not telling you what you have to do and how you have to do it. The business itself has to meet certain information security requirements. So the business has to be secure. There are different ways of doing it. The way that things are being done at the moment has additional complexity. You have to achieve these outcomes, and part of those outcomes are operating in a secure way, because that's part of the business requirements. What I'm doing is coming in and going, right, you have to achieve these outcomes anyway. What I'm going to do is work with you to make that as easy and simple for you as possible. Therefore, actually making your life easier and simpler. So I'm benefiting you directly, because ultimately you still have to achieve this, and I'm allowing you to achieve this in a way that makes your life easier and simpler. So I'm improving your processes and improving the ways that you're working, and reducing and make your burdens and overheads, and making easy to meet your objectives. And how can I make your life easier? Because ultimately, again, with it being modular, it's flexible, is based on your business area. How do we most efficiently and effectively, based on these common standards, achieve these outcomes for you, and build it in a way that gets them there with the least possible grief and aggravation, and therefore makes their lives easier? Because if you make their lives easier and you involve them in the process, so they get invested in the improvement, so that they're being made, they then become champions of that improvement or change, and it makes it easier and reduces friction to get that implemented, and more importantly, sustainably followed long term.
I want to give us an example.
Oh, let's look at,
Obviously, without naming names, right?
yeah.
So,
Yeah, I'm not going to mention any names, but if we look at, as it's a hot topic at the moment, supply chains.
in retail,
Doesn't necessarily have to be retail, but every business has a supply chain, works with third parties and vendors. Ultimately, the procurement and commercials and everything around that, they have to identify, assess, onboard, manage, and offboard third parties and vendors. So by integrating in the security components, and you have your IS schedule, you have your control requirements all predefined and risk linked. So you basically go, well, you're risk assessing the vendors anyway, and based on the risk assessment, you have a predefined set of levels. So you go, are they low, medium, high, critical? And dependent on the risk level, you would then assign the basically the appropriate controls. Because if you're just buying pencils from somebody, you'd still want them to have a degree of security, because they still have some degree of data, but you don't really, it's not sensitive, so you don't really have to give them War and Peace. But if they're working with you on your crown jewels, then you're going to make them critical, and you're going to want them to be as secure as possible. But that's all predefined and built into the workflow, so it allows them to gather the information required to assess the third parties, carry out the assessment, assign an appropriate score, and then build out and package up the relevant contracts and annexes, because everything's predefined. So it speeds up your essentially time to assess and get ready to onboard. You've got everything pre-aligned and predefined, so then you can onboard more quickly and easily, because you've got a lot of that stuff out of the way and everything's mapped out. You know what your KPIs are. So then when you've onboarded them, all their criteria and controls are predefined and in the contract, so they're enforceable. You know what you need to assess them by. The assessment questionnaires are linked to the third-party control matrix, so everything then can auto-generate. So because it's all tied together and integrated and predefined, it then allows you to more readily automate things and therefore reduce the burden. So you can get from identifying a potential third party through to onboarding them a lot quicker, because everything works as a single flow rather than going, oh, we have this stage gate in this process, I have to go out to this department, and then you're waiting for them to get back. It's already built and integrated into the workflow, so you can get through it a lot quicker and more effectively. And then because it's all in place and it's all standardized, when you come to managing and assessing and reviewing and auditing your vendors, it's all in place, it's all enforceable, it's all predefined. So the management burden reduces, and then you've also got all your processes and criteria predefined for offboarding. So should you need to offboard a vendor, everything's there predefined. You work through the workflow and it's end to end integrated, so you can get through it with minimal hassle, fuss, and complexity.
Effectively, what you're doing is you're limiting the paralysis by analysis. Like you said, you're not having to reach out to other stakeholders. It's all done. And let's be fair, right? Whenever you're doing these types of campaigns, onboarding, offboarding, attestations, things like that, half the time you're waiting on all these external stakeholders that it's not their primary function, right? They still have to have their say, but they might be on annual leave, they might have another critical project that they're doing, you might be bottom of the thing, they might just deprioritize it, right? And you're just stuck there in limbo, which is ultimately adding all this.
And then every year they assess, review, and update the centralized matrix. So they're only having to review it once and it's all predefined. There will be some involvement that they will need. For example, any responses will need to be assessed and responded, but you're reducing it down to the minute to what is absolutely necessary.
So I understand that when it comes to a supply chain example, it's all predefined. It's in contract, it's enforceable, right? What about the unknown unknowns? So we all know in any function, right, in any team, even in IT, there are always ways to kind of circumvent, or there are plenty of processes that we follow that aren't documented. They're just known, right? When you know it, sort of thing. So I guess how would like an InfoSec manager or a CISO or anything that goes, okay, I've got 50 workflows, right? 50 things documented that are supposed to be the core. But I know there's the best part of another 20, 30 out there in the ether that my team are doing.
Yeah.
How do you start to, I guess, recognize that or start to document? Because you're going to have to capture that sort of unknown area, aren't you?
But that's where the principles come in. So you have a common set of principles, practices, objectives, controls, and requirements. And you can build your workflows at a business level, however best fits that use case. However, it must align to these common sets of principles, practices, and requirements. So it allows them to take the appropriate modules and build their processes using those modules to achieve the desired outcomes and objectives for them, and the standardized objectives and requirements and deliverables from an InfoSec criteria from an InfoSec perspective. So you define the requirements from the controls, and they know where they need to get to, and you have the predefined modules so they can just slot it into place.
That's interesting, sir, because it's I'm thinking about reference to current supply chain challenges. And you said there, obviously, you can view the matrix of annually, right? And I'm thinking there, and this is just from a conversation that I was having the other week. One thing that had never really occurred to me, but cyber insurance. We have these challenges in supply chain, etc. And the viewpoint that I've seen, which I think, if I'm understanding this correct, like if you get these principles in place, you can limit this impact to you as a CISO, right? Cyber insurance is typically something that is going to be managed or renewed definitely by
and owned most likely by the
CFO, finance, ops, etc. And I mean, I don't know about you, but like my house insurance changes every so often, and they say you've got to have a new standard of locks. You've got to, I'm thinking motorbikes now, like Thatcham alarms, if you remember that, like you couldn't get insured unless you had that. But those are terms and conditions of your policy that the business signs you up to, without taking into account your input, your roadmap, what you have in place already. So I guess those principles are probably going to help.
And that's, so that would be, and that would fall under the principle of stakeholder management and engagement. Okay. So you would, So especially if you're a larger business, you should, well, I would say must have someone with the CSO role, Chief Security Officer role. That doesn't necessarily mean they need a CSO, but somebody must own that responsibility and have accountability at board exec level of information and cybersecurity. And where things fall within the sphere of that stakeholder, then that stakeholder should be engaged. For example, if a business is making a decision with a financial impact, depending on that impact, they're not necessarily going to go to the CFO, but they are going to involve finance because they have to, because the business mandates it and goes, you cannot make financial decisions without a person with appropriately delegated financial authority. Why should information and cybersecurity be any different? You can delegate authority. Those delegation, those levels of responsibility and demarcation between those authority levels should be defined and communicated. So it doesn't necessarily have to go to the board exec level person. But where there are decisions that have a financial implication, an appropriately approved and authorized person is involved and has to be involved in order for that decision to be signed off.
Yeah.
The same should be for information and cybersecurity. At which point, when you're making decisions on, or when a decision, because it is a decision, you have to renew it, but a decision is signing off that policy, it is an information and cybersecurity decision. It is a financial decision. It is a general business decision. There is a commercial decision. So you would involve lawyers. At which point the person with the appropriate authority from an InfoSec point of view should be involved. And this is where the OSbD framework would make it easier, because when you would integrate into that framework everything that you have around requirements for InfoSec. So there would be third-party requirements. There could be customers when they have their security assessment questionnaires. You can integrate that in, which then means it's very easy to respond to audits and questionnaires and queries. And also you would integrate in your information and cybersecurity, your cybersecurity requirements, insurance policy requirements. And although I said you'd review it annually, that's subject to no change, but that's also where the integrated framework makes it easier, because you then go, okay, well, this thing has changed, whether it's a compliance, governance, regulation, standards, custom requirement. You go, okay, what's the delta? Where does that delta fall within the framework? What does that delta map to in terms of controls and capability areas? And then you look at that specifically, so you don't have to review everything you're doing. You know exactly where that sits in your organizational capability around security, so you can target specifically on making the appropriate changes and updates to that area.
Also, as well, it'll help anyone in security kind of have that impact assessment for it, right? So it's okay, we might not have this in place, but what's the impact if, say, we can't meet that part of the premium, or no doubt this happens, obviously, where it'll become part of the policy, and let's say the technology to meet that requirement's like 100 grand, but then the damage to the company is maybe 50 grand. Okay, you go, okay, accept that risk, right? But at least then, from a security standpoint, security don't have the tools and the position to start to say to finance and go, we don't have that. Here's the risk, right? Now it's down to finance. Now it's down to commercial, legal to make a business decision and go, look, from our perspective, we've given you the risks, we've mapped it out. If there's areas that we don't know, we can take some time to go map it out, because you're asking us to assess that impact, right? And then ultimately, whenever those other functions come back to you and say, right, this needs to be implemented, like you said, you modularize it, you slot it into the framework, and then it's part of that foundation, that framework, that underlying framework, isn't it?
Exactly. Well, it has been, I'm trying to remember, 7-8 years in the making. The seeds were planted then. They started, I guess, gestating. Be about 6 to 7 years ago was was when they first started being planted, and they've been developed over the last 5 or so years.
I guess in those 5 years, then coming back to a comment you made earlier in the episode, it's not cheap, it's not a quick thing. You're not trying to, it's not snake oil selling. This is the reality, but it's about long-term gain. It's about long-term realization.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. So cheaper doesn't mean cheap. Quicker doesn't mean quick. Simpler doesn't mean simple. But it's a quicker, cheaper, and simpler way of doing it when compared to other ways of working.
I guess in your experience, then somebody reached out to you. Where's the start point? What's a realistic expectation? Like 6 months, maybe you would say, agree those underlying principles, right? Before you start doing policy mapping and then workflow mapping. And I guess the other end of that spectrum, somebody starts on this journey, and it is a journey. How long would you say it would take medium established business, say a few thousand, employees, something of that sort of size, to kind of have this in production working? Like, what's the kind of expectancy that they could have?
Typically for a let's say mid-sized business, so high hundreds to maybe 1,000, maybe slightly over 1,000, let's say 750 to 1,500, dependent on buy-in and level of engagement. The discovery, assessment, and planning stages, so doing the information gathering, doing the initial assessing in terms of where are you, where do you need to get to, so your as is, your to be, the gap analysis, and then the planning. 3 to 4 months you can have a roadmap.
Wow.
Because I've systemized it all. I did one for a tech AI startup that was acquired by a large technology company, and the initial sort of discovery, assessment, and planning phase was 10.
Very achievable, very short term, sort of low hanging fruits that can be achieved from this framework.
Yep.
Brilliant.
And I did one for a particular capability, so not InfoSec entirely, but a particular capability of a particular large retailer, and from start to finish to get both a short-term and long-term roadmap was 4 months, but that covered Christmas.
So really, 2.5, 3 months, let's be perfectly honest. Like
3 months, yeah.
Wow.
30, about 14 weeks, 14, 15 weeks.
Wow. So I guess to any of the listeners, if they wanted to talk to you more about the OSbD framework, maybe pick your brains a little bit more about how it could work in their organization, like where can people find you?
So obviously LinkedIn, online, just look for, I guess, get Loopli, so GETLOOPLI. And then obviously I do work with businesses other than the larger enterprise side. And to give another example, I built a proposal based on my systemized approach for ISO 9, 14, and 27001, so all three, to get them audit ready. So not to get them through the audit and receive certification, but get them ready to start the stage 1 audit with contingency within 3 months. For smaller businesses, I've done start to finish, kick off to receiving certification of 9 and 27001 in 9 to 10 weeks.
That's epic. Yeah, look, to any of our listeners, reach out to Owen. Clearly, it's nice and systematic. Some very interesting insights there about how you can build obviously this framework modularize it, get the principles of security across the organization, and I guess how you start to tackle those political conversations, right? Like, how do you get people to think about cybersec and not just obviously their own worlds in a very siloed way, right? Owen, before we kind of shut off today, one quick question, mate. Like, is there anybody that you were with or you love listening to that you think's got some insights that think could share something interesting to our audience?
Yes, so I would say Glenn from EnigmaNet would be a good guest to call in. So they've got an excellent SD-WAN, traffic optimization, QoS all-in solution.
Cool. Well, we'll reach out to Glenn then, see if we can make that happen. But Owen, thanks very much for taking the time. And again, people can visit him on getloopli.com. Well, until next time, see you in a bit.